I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Josh Hammer.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So today we have a SCOTUS special. Obviously, there's just been a number of historic Supreme Court rulings this week. I mean, obviously, the most important of which was Dobbs overturning Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, but there's plenty else to talk about. Second Amendment free exercise cases. So today we have from the various contributors. First, Josh is going to talk about the historic week at SCOTUS. Ben is going to specifically focus on the Second Amendment cases and the right to bear arms. I'm going to be talking about a couple of free exercise of religion Establishment Clause cases. And finally, Emily is going to look at what life looks like after Roe versus Wade. So kick that one off. I think, we start with Josh.
Okay, so I guess the first thing to say at the top of the show is just wow. Really just wow. I think a lot of us who have kind of come of age in the conservative movement, a lot of us who have kind of come of age in the conservative legal movement, perhaps in particular, we caught the white whale. I mean, like, we did it. I mean, like, really, since the beginning of the modern conservative legal project 40 years ago, the Federal Society was founded in 1982. This has been the goal. Literally, this has been the goal since before any of the four of us were born. The overturning of Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey has been, by orders of magnitude, the preeminent goal. So just what an incredible week. We're going to dive into the Dobbs case, but I just wanted to set the table here. I mean, I think for a lot of us, and I count myself among them, who have kind of just been kind of perennial pessimists about like all things judiciary, judicial branch related, this has been an interesting week, and it's just been an eye-opening week. And a lot of us, I think, who for years argued that the judiciary is just a one-way ratchet, and that the way to kind of dispose of the judicial branch is to kind of oppose judicial supremacy and to just kind of quash these rulings. It's going to be a summer of a lot of contemplation about how a lot of things have been said and how a lot of arguments have been made, to be honest with you. But we're going to get into all this. The Dobbs abortion ruling, of course, there was a massive Second Amendment case. Ben will talk about that. And any other term, by the way, this Second Amendment case would have been the marquee case. This is a case called Bruin out of New York State. It's a magisterial 60-plus page majority opinion from Justice Clarence Thomas, likely his career-defining majority opinion to date. We will see what happens next term in the affirmative action case. But to date is the first time that the Supreme Court has actually said that bear arms, not just keep arms, but bear arms means what it said. We had two amazing religious liberty victories in a case called Carson versus Macon out of Maine, and then a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. This is the so-called Coach Kennedy case out of Washington State, the former of which, the case Carson out of Maine, basically said that a state cannot discriminate against religious schools with its public tax dollars. We'll talk about that. And then the Coach Kennedy case, of course, is kind of this really interesting kind of mix of free exercise clause and establishment clause, where the court actually finally indicated that Lemon versus Kurtzman, a 1971 case, the so-called Lemon test for religious endorsement, has finally apparently been overruled. It has now gotten the proverbial red flag treatment on Westlaw for lawyers. So it is now a formally bad law, which is just that in and of itself. It's fine. Overturning Lemon is like the third most important thing that's happened over the past week. And like I'm telling you, as a former religious liberty litigator, that has been a goal for decades. So just a monumental week. But in my remaining time here, I do want to focus on the Dobbs case, because it really just is just a remarkable achievement. It really kind of feels surreal, to be honest with you, to be living here in America in a government that is not ruled by the judicial and moral tyranny that was Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So it's a massive opinion, including all the dissents and the appendices, well over 200 pages. Would encourage the listeners and viewers to go ahead and read it for yourselves. From my perspective, one of the big takeaway items is the fact that the court did not cave. They did not cave after this unprecedented leak that happened in Politico in early May. After this, we have been in uncharted waters since then, truly. I mean, they have thrown the entire book, these mostly peaceful protests culminating. I say that in jest, obviously. They're not mostly peaceful. They've been firebombing pro-life crisis pregnancy centers. It was culminating in a literal assassination attempt. Thank God, aborted at the last second, but against Justice Brett Kavanaugh. So we had been in uncharted waters now for the past month and a half, and they really did it. Those five justices from that leaked opinion with Justice Alito, they stiffened their spine and they really did it. So praise be, I think, first and foremost to all of them. Praise be, of course, to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who I think a lot of us on the right, if Rachel were here, I would be curious for her thoughts. She's obviously been a leading critic of Mitch McConnell's over the years, but I think even Rachel would admit that Mitch McConnell certainly deserves some credit now for what he did during the Trump administration, going all the way back to the Merrick Garland holds in the 2016 election. Praise, obviously, to former President Donald Trump, who, talk about promises made, promises kept. Go back to the 2016 election. There's clips of him in the debate saying, I will nominate pro-life justices who were overturned Roe versus Wade. And my God, he really did it here. So just a truly, truly historic opinion. We're going to come back to the Dobbs discussion at the end. I'm sure I'll have more to say on it as well. But for the sake of time here, I do want to just throw it open to all three of you guys. Just a truly, truly historic week, but no bigger story, obviously, than the Dobbs case.
Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead. I think this is really the result of finally having a durable Supreme Court majority. Remember that Amy Coney Barrett was, essentially confirmed in late 2020. That's the last, I think, change in the Supreme Court. And I guess because she wouldn't have been involved in a lot of the hearing of the 2020 term cases, we weren't really kind of fully seeing what it would mean to have this full durable majority. And now we do. Because you look especially at Dobbs, we'll get more of this later, but Justice Roberts's opinion was terrible, right? It was more silly, right? I respect the Democrats' opinion more because it actually had a clear and consistent position, which is Roe is precedent, stare decisis. That makes sense. Roberts said we should be more incrementalist and respect stare decisis, but would have put in place an entirely new standard to evaluate abortion law. Like that would have required a whole new set of cases to litigate. He wanted to create this reasonable opportunity to get an abortion standard for, what will be lawful. And in a previous, version of the court, that would have been a controlling opinion, right? That would have been what was the conservatives would have had to sign on to that to get a majority. But now we have the Clarence Thomas court. Clarence Thomas is effectively the Chief Justice, and Roberts is whatever BS incrementalism is not relevant, right? There's 5 solid conservatives in the court that can just ignore him if they want, which is exactly what happened in Dobbs. And so I think, to Josh's point, like we're really finally at the point where there is actually conservative control of the Supreme Court, right? That a conservative philosophy dominates, regardless whether it's originalist or not. It's certainly conservative, and I think that we'll get into more of this, but that implicates how strongly we view the need to change how much influence the court has over our lives. Maybe if a conservative court is a useful thing.
I know. Yeah, I would just add to that point, this entire term, I think, underscores how much legislative punting has gone on over the last, couple of decades, and how the court has taken center stage alongside with the administrative state in really ruling the day-to-day lives of so many of us. And obviously, that's not to criticize the Roe decision or the Dobbs decision at all. It's more to criticize the Roe decision originally, at just how consequential these decisions were, and how truly, I think, difficult it has become to bind this country together. Obviously, I say become, not to mitigate the fact that it was extremely difficult to bind this country together in the past. But I think some of these cultural gulfs are, as we sort them out, through the courts and on the national stage, becoming increasingly difficult. And that's a big takeaway. But I think the conservative legal movement saw that coming. To Josh's point, and looking back on the last several decades, it took a long time to set up a court that would be this consequential and this sort of necessary, and it happened. So with that, I'll toss to Ben.
So I've remained skeptical of the Supreme Court, but you have to say that they're, in many respects, this is an unalloyed series of exceptional opinions rendered here. Roberts bequounded himself, I think, in that opinion. And I was happy to see that if you look at the edits between the draft Dobbs opinion and what the actual ruling was, you see that Alito took him to task for it, rightfully so. I truly hope that Will is right, that this is the Thomas court. I think certainly directionally it is. When you look at attempts to rein in and challenge, and this will probably continue this term and subsequently, the administrative state, obviously, as I'll get to in a minute, in terms of the right to bear arms, Justice Thomas, in his opinion, which I think was also concurring opinion in the Dobbs case, went on to challenge substantive due process itself. Stare decisis is being challenged, the concept itself. These are all epical, massive game changes in our jurisprudence, back to what our jurisprudence should be, in my view. And for that, I think, and Josh wrote very eloquently about this in the past week, Thomas is a revolutionary figure on this court. He is laying down the gauntlet now in a whole series of cases that paves the way for potentially, again, in other areas as well, we've talked about with big tech and common carrier and the like, in a whole slew of areas, changing the game and returning power where it ought to be to the people. And that, two brief points on that. One is all the people who talk about defending our democracy, which of course does not mean our democracy, it means their power, have not a word to say positive about democracy here, that abortion will go back to the states and the people where it should have been and always ought to have been, never in the Constitution. And then also the last point I'll make briefly, and maybe we can return to it later, is just the chasm on display here is quite interesting between our elite, our ruling class, and where the court ended up coming down on a whole slew of issues. They're operating in two wholly distinct worlds, I'm proud to say, because I was not sure that the court would hold up in several different instances, and that the court would remain insulated in large part, the conservatives on the court, from public opinion and all the pressure that they were being subjected to, leaving aside the Chief Justice. So I think all those are to the good. And let's hope we actually get back to legislating in this country, would be the last point that I would make. With that, I guess I'll transition to my own segment, and we'll talk about this Bruin case, which, as Josh has defined it, might be the magnum opus for Justice Thomas, perhaps his most magisterial opinion. And really, he lays it out at the end of the opinion. What the ruling is that New York's proper cause requirement for obtaining an unrestricted license to carry a concealed firearm violates the 14th Amendment in that it prevents law-abiding citizens with ordinary self-defense needs from exercising their Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. That is, you have a right to keep and bear arms, and it's not just in your home, but it's out in the world as well. And Thomas himself talks about how laughable the notion is that you only get to bear arms in your home when people aren't generally bearing arms, wearing their firearms within their house. But even setting that aside, I just want to read a couple passages from it, and then we can talk about sort of the broader takeaways, what the ramifications are going to be in the real world for this ruling. But this opinion masterfully lays out Justice Thomas's interpretation of what the Constitution says, the plain text of the Constitution, plus then looking to historical precedent, which are the historical basis for it, and natural rights, by the way, which, as Thomas notes, is what we apply to every other amendment of the Constitution. But for some reason, the Second Amendment gets treated differently. So he writes in part, when the Second Amendment's plain text covers an individual's conduct, the Constitution presumptively protects that conduct. To justify its regulation, the government may not simply posit that the regulation promotes an important interest. Rather, the government must demonstrate that the regulation is consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Only if a firearm regulation is consistent with this nation's historical tradition may court conclude that the individual's conduct falls outside the Second Amendment's quote unquote unqualified demand. And he goes on to talk about the fact that there was this two-step approach applied to gun regulation in the past, and referencing the Heller opinion, which this sort of builds on Scalia's majority opinion in Heller. Step one of the predominant framework is broadly consistent with Heller, which demands a test rooted in the Second Amendment's text as informed by history. Heller and McDonald do not support applying means-end scrutiny in the Second Amendment context. Instead, the government must affirmatively prove its firearms regulation is part of the historical tradition that delimits the outer bounds to the right to keep and bear arms. And then Thomas goes through the whole slew of history around the Second Amendment, and he concludes as follows. Apart from a few late 19th century outlier jurisdictions, American governments simply have not broadly prohibited the public carry of commonly used firearms for personal defense, nor, subject to a few late in time outliers, have American governments required law-abiding responsible citizens to demonstrate a special need for self-protection distinguishable from that of the general community in order to carry arms in public. So obviously this ruling is going to have massive implications for the minority of states that follow a similar sort of Second Amendment regime to New York. It's worth noting also that just as Justice Alito rebutted Justice Roberts in that Dobbs opinion, Justice Alito in his concurring opinion here takes to task the left and challenges it on a whole slew of arguments it makes around, raising recent mass shootings as some sort of justification for their infringements on the Second Amendment. So once again, this builds on Heller-Witch itself and McDonald as well, were both critical decisions in terms of the right to keep and bear arms, the natural right to self-defense, the core of the Second Amendment, not going out and hunting deer. And this is just a massive opinion by Justice Thomas. It's good for law-abiding citizens. Hopefully, it will make criminals think twice. And by the way, this is desperately needed in America, given the massive rise in violent crime and the response by authorities up to and including the DOJ, which shamefully in this case, and as well in the Dobbs opinion, went out and I think in an unprecedented fashion, don't quote me on that, but potentially in an unprecedented fashion, came out and basically said, we disagree with this decision. We respect the court, but we disagree. That in and of itself is a very disturbing development in response, just as the violence in the streets and the rage is a disturbing response to Dobbs, but this is par for the course from the left. Thank God the court held strong in this instance. With that, I'm open. Josh, I know you've written about this. Feel free to jump in and talk about what you think the ultimate implications are, but open to anyone else as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a gun rights guy, as I've talked about in this show many times. I mean, I've had a concealed carry permit for many years now, and it's just a wonderful opinion. But I guess my biggest takeaway from this case, and you mentioned this, Ben, as well, is the vindication of Justice Clarence Thomas. The court decided two extremely high-profile Second Amendment cases in fairly quick succession: the DC versus Heller case of 2008, and then McDonald versus Chicago of 2010, and then for 12 years. They consistently denied cert. They consistently denied petitions to try to codify like a real clarified meaning of the scope of the right. They were content to let the lower courts kind of sort it out, and especially like this Ninth Circuit two-step test in a way that disproportionately harmed, obviously, law-abiding gun owners. And Justice Thomas, in particular, repeatedly dissented from those denials of those writs of cert, where he consistently kind of chided his colleagues for treating the Second Amendment as a quote-unquote second-class right. So he gets the last laugh now. They granted cert. They've done the right thing here in clarion fashion. So good for him. Like I said at the in my segment last time, in any other Supreme Court term, this is a marquee case. In any other Supreme Court term where there's not the overturning of Roe versus Wade, this is a big freaking deal. Because again, I just want to emphasize, this is the first time in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court that they have said that bear arms, not just keep arms, actually does mean exactly what it says. It's crazy, obviously, because we're 230 plus years into this constitutional republic, but this is the first time that they have clarified that exact language. We'll see where it goes from here, obviously. I'll just quickly add to the commentary on the Justice Alito concurring opinion in the Bruin case. I thought it was really delectable from my perspective to see Justice Alito just completely poke fun at this unhinged dissent from Justice Breyer and the liberal justices, who they saw fit to invoke Uvalde, Buffalo, all these mass shootings. And Justice Alito basically says, are you trying to tell me that New York State, if more people could concealed carry in that supermarket, that this guy would have been deterred, and that he wouldn't have been stopped sooner? So it was really just delicious. And, I just love Sam Alito so much, as well as Clarence Thomas.
It's probably ripe for another discussion, but it's amazing what amateur hour it is on the left side of this bench. And like these opinions that their dissents have been, in contrast to the opinions, have been shockingly bad. Roe itself has always been, a bad opinion. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think somebody who wasn't, say what you want about her, was not sort of stuck in amateur hour. She even understood that. And that's been, I think, a theme of this court. I mean, Sotomayor's logic, it's just sometimes listening to her in the Dobbs case, for instance, in the back and forth with attorneys, it's painful, truly painful. I can't imagine for the lawyers who have to listen to that, what it sounds like. But I think that's probably an undercovered story, because there have been so many, I think, conservative victories and so many solid opinions that we haven't had time yet to dig into just how sophomoric the logic has been from the left side of this court. But the gun opinion, or the gun dissent, was certainly a good one. I think the Dobbs dissent was a good one. But in this dissent in particular, it is great to see Alito just thrash the sophomoric logic that and that's a great contrast between the conservative legal project and the left's legal project, which it's just like I think they take a lot of things for granted because they've been able to bulldoze every other institution and set the cultural norms that they fundraised off of Roe going away. They fundraised off all of these fear mongering about precedent and everything, but they never really expected it to. Truly, they never really expected it to. Dobbs caught them completely off guard. So with that, I'll kick it over to Ben.
No, me.
To Will, sorry, it's Ben's topic.
I did, when I was actually trying to write onto the law review, failing in this instance for reasons I can get into later. But the topic of the write-on was the Second Amendment cases in 2015. And I got a real familiarity with what the courts of appeals were doing in the aftermath of Heller, which is basically ignoring it, right? They would acknowledge that Heller created this right to bear arms in your home, but then the test they would apply to every single new gun regulation or different gun regulation was this sort of like utilitarian means end two-step test that basically allowed them to uphold every gun regulation that they looked at. Including ones that seemed extreme. And I think the real dramatic effect of this ruling is not just that Thomas upheld this CCW or struck down the New York CCW law, but that he struck down this two-step approach everywhere. And so I think going forward, it's funny. I remember reading Brett Kavanaugh's dissent when he was on the DC circuit in the Heller 2 case, which basically made this point, like, you guys are completely doing this wrong. You have to solely focus on history. And he was drowned out by all the liberals who were like, no, but these gun regulations are so positive and wonderful. Like, no. This is not the analysis you would use in the First Amendment. It's not the analysis you would use in the Fifth Amendment. None of this means end stuff. It's all about, does this comport with our history? So with that, I get to pivot over to the free exercise of religion. So we had two big cases here. We had the Carson v. Macon case, which was decided, the opinion came out on that last week. That was the case that dealt with essentially the state of Maine had set up this tuition program whereby if you lived in an area without a secondary school, like a high school, they would give you X amount of money per year to spend at a school of your choice, so long as that school was non-sectarian, i.e. non-religious. And then the court that legislation had passed muster in both the district court in Maine and the First Circuit Court of Appeals. And finally, you have the Supreme Court being like, no, that seems like a very clear discrimination and very clear violation of the free exercise of religion. And then the second, which is another free exercise case, is this Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, whereby a high school football coach would, after the game was over, had decided that he wanted to offer up a prayer at midfield on a regular basis. Sometimes people would join him, sometimes they wouldn't. And this had been going on for years. But at one point, the school administrator found out about it after he was, another coach had sent a letter applauding him for this practice. The school administrator found out about it and tried to shut it down as a violation of the Establishment Clause. And here again, the court says, no, this is a free exercise violation. They have to let him engage in these private these private exercises of religion. So I'm reading both the dissents. I'm not actually, I wouldn't call myself like a free exercise expert. And I think I'm really looking forward to learning what Josh has to say about all this, but in terms of like his understanding. But it seems pretty clear that, again, we actually have this sort of shift as a result of these two cases in terms of where we can expect the law to go, moving forward. Whereas before, it seemed like if there was any sort of tension between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, right, where, a government school is worried that they're allowing people to speak, or a government institution is worried about they're supporting religion in some way, but, and that leads them to discriminate against religion. In prior cases, the courts might have said, okay, that's fine. You have to not participate in establishment religion, separation of church and state. That's good. And now we have a more modern court that's like, actually, no, you can't discriminate against religious exercise. And merely saying that you're not allowed to discriminate against religion isn't a violation of the Establishment Clause. We're not creating a theocracy by saying, no, you can't just cut off all the funding. You can't offer funding to everybody and then exclude religious schools. And no, you can't just tell some high school football coach that he can't pray. And I think that's really positive because, what strikes me is how paranoid these public schools were about having any appearance of an establishment of religion. And yet we have all these debates going on about, and they're just completely letting wokeness in, through the front door. And in a world where I think it's going to be very important going forward, that in a world where there's no real constitutional control of wokeness education, if you will, that there has to be some counterbalancing of allowing a lot more essentially religion and religious exposure in the public sphere and in public schools, and ultimately also allowing for private school, to ensure that religious schools themselves are not being excluded from funding. Anyway, those are the two big things. But I want to steer it to Josh, because I want to hear what he has to say about this as a former religious liberty litigator. Right.
So these are two great incremental victories, but very strong incremental victories. And the combined effect of them, I think, is quite palpable. So the original sin, so to speak, in religious liberty jurisprudence in many respects in America is the notion of separation of church and state itself, which, as anyone who's ever read the First Amendment could tell you, is not in there. It's totally fabricated. Thomas Jefferson used the rhetoric of a quote unquote wall of separation in a 231 word letter that he wrote in 1802, years after the Constitution was drafted. He wasn't even at the Constitutional Convention, Thomas Jefferson, first of all. And it wasn't until 145 years after that, in a 1947 case called Everson, where the court first put into the Supreme Court canon this notion of separation of church and state. There was an absolutely remarkable writing by former Justice Bill Rehnquist in a 1982 case called Wallace versus Jaffrey, where he just systemically shows that this notion of separation of church and state was never in there. But nonetheless, in the aftermath of Everson, there was a ton of just horrible precedent in this realm. I alluded to it earlier, this 1971 case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, where the court fabricated this test to try to see whether like a public crucifix or just anything in the public realm had the purpose of endorsing religion. But as Justice Scalia wrote in a concurrence in a case called Lamb's Chapel in 1993, advancing religion was totally kosher at the time of the American founding. All you could not do was penalize someone for not adhering to a certain conception of the deity. But advancing religion in general as a public matter was entire. I mean, that was a core purpose of government, in fact, at the time of the American founding. So a lot of this modern precedent in this space has had the effect, as Will alluded to, of actually discriminating against religious people. They have not been available. They've not had the benefit of having access to generally available public benefits. And there's one thing that the Roberts Court has done in recent years. There was the Trinity Lutheran case of 2017. There was the Espinoza case out of Montana in 2020. To an extent, there was the Fulton case in Philadelphia last summer. Now, this one, look, this court has consistently said that when it comes to generally available public benefits, you cannot discriminate in favor of secular and against religious people. So that's obviously a good rule. The fact that this Lemon case from 1971 has been overturned is an outstanding development. But yeah, to Will's point, I mean, I think a lot of progressives like the ADL has been a terrible advocate in this space. Just a lot of just progressive groups in general have taken such a strong view of this ahistorical separationist conception of the Establishment Clause that they have then discriminated against religious in violation of Free Exercise Clause. So this court is finally starting to just truly undo decades and decades of terrible, terrible precedent in this space. I just want to quickly say my former colleagues at First Liberty Institute were counsel on both of these cases, actually. So, huge congratulations to my friends and former colleagues at First Liberty for these two great victories as well.
Anybody else want to talk?
So I can jump in briefly just to underscore a couple of threads that have been raised, at least tangentially here. One being that I think one paradigm by which to look at the way that the ruling class has imposed its rule is through imposing a state anti-religion of progressivism in every single one of our institutions. And so I think these rulings in some ways can be viewed as a backlash against the fact that the state anti-religion has encroached upon every single institution, and that is all to the good. And that's not a values neutral, we're just going to discriminate against all religions equally except our own. They're saying that their religion is the one true religion, and it's the only one that can be followed. And if you don't literally bow down and submit to it, then you ought to be excommunicated from public life. And I think that is the way to understand the progressive ideology. But number two, and I think I raised this last week as well, but it's worth noting again, in almost every single public event that took place from the time of our founding onward, I assume, I would gather probably for decades thereafter, every single event essentially started with a prayer, including legislative sessions, which of course still do to a large extent, precisely because the founders, again, even the deists, even the ones who might have been atheistic themselves, nevertheless understood the value of inculcating Judeo-Christian religion in the populace. Did not mean a theocracy, but it certainly did not mean discriminating against religion in the public square. And so kudos to the Supreme Court here for restoring some semblance of that balance. It'd be interesting to think about what the country would be like had we not had progressivism imposed as our state religion and religion completely removed from the public square up until, to some extent, these cases. But it is worth noting, again, as Justice Thomas alluded to, what the history is here. And the history is no state religion that ought to be imposed upon you by the federal government anyway. But by the way, there were state religions, official religions within states well into the 1800s as well. There's a history that the left won't talk about, again, because they want their religion or anti-religion to be the only one that exists in this country.
I was just going to say, that's the important point. Their ideology or their religion is anti-religion. It is fundamentally anti-Judeo-Christian. It is anti-traditionalism, and that means that it's anti just about 50% or more of this country, probably more in cases where you're looking like athletics, transgender ideology, and everything like that. And it's one of those things where we used to get test cases that are sort of testing our system's interpretation of the Constitution, and this is why people like Will and Josh, I think, love constitutional law, because you're sort of diving into the theory of what these words the framers used, what this language means, what is the good, and what is the proper interpretation of all of it. And these conversations are fascinating, but these test cases used to be sort of one-offs, right? Like some dummy would put up some monument next to the Ten Commandments to Satan, right? Like we would have those test cases like this, or just random things. You can think of a handful of cases over the years. This is interesting because it is a test case, but it's one that could conceivably happen at every school in America right now. Every single one of them. And that would represent a worldview that is far more common than some of these cases used to be, I guess, gauging or putting through the sort of stress test, the constitutional stress test. And so while this decision was rendered properly, it's going to, I guess, politics, culture is also downstream of politics, as we like to say here, and that's an important point. And I think this is an important case in that direction. But yes, our institutions, the question is whether they were ever able to maintain that hallowed sense of neutrality that even the ACLU used to fight for, or if this was sort of an inevitable consequence. These sorts of norms being changed was an inevitable consequence. But on a sunny, happy, optimistic note, it was decided the right way, and the system worked properly. And speaking of which, I think we can transition to our fourth topic, which is life after Roe v. Wade, life after Dobbs. I was writing a story actually on Friday about. I think it was about basically that women can see the post Dobbs world as a liberating one, and just writing post Dobbs felt really good. It felt like something significant had really shifted. Now we all have ideas about what's exactly going to be on the political and cultural table when it comes to abortion going forward. We have suggestions, I'm sure, for Republicans who are going to be debating different policies and proposing certain policies. I do think a lot of different things that this is going to test the incrementalism once again. It's going to test whether people want to start talking about abortifacients like Plan B, and these conversations are going to be huge, and they're going to be difficult, and they're going to be a big test for the conservative movement. But we often, I think, forget how dramatically Roe affected literally everything, the sexual ethics of this country. That's why I was glad when our friends Ryan Anderson and Alexandra DeSanctis wrote a book about how abortion is tearing us apart, how it affects everything, basically is the subtitle of their book. Janet Yellen wrote a paper, in the late 90s with her husband for the Brookings Institute that talked about how abortion had actually increased single parenthood because as it had been legalized in the years leading up to the Roe decision itself, different states had legalized abortion, obviously, you could see that people were more comfortable having sex without consequences, or sex outside of commitment, I should say. And the piece that I wrote on Friday for the Federalist was saying women should now feel liberated that they can have sex like women. They can, be liberated from the Dave Portnoy idea about hookup culture that Gen Z has been complaining about to places even like BuzzFeed News over the last few years. And so this decision is obviously first and foremost important because it's saving lives and restoring the moral integrity of our country. It also, though, will have, I think, sweeping cultural effects that are downstream of the cultural effects that Roe in and of itself. It was such a sickness. And while abortion will be legal in about half the country and will be legal probably up until 15 weeks, if not longer, in other parts of the country, this is in the same way that we talked about in the last segment, the way that culture is downstream of politics. This is a norm. This is an opportunity, I think a major opportunity for conservatives, for the pro-life movement to start making the argument that what abortion did was normalize a very unhealthy and very abnormal sexual order. And it's one that hurt women. It's one that was mainstreamed rapidly. The industrialized abortion technology we have had over the last half century is just that. It was brought about by technology. It's another thing we don't often think of, sort of as it went from the back alleys to doctors' offices. It was certainly safer, but it was industrialized in absolutely ghastly ways. And it was the abortion by mail pills that are now going to become normalized, that already have been normalized, is a very, very frightening future because it takes away the sort of gravity of what you're doing. It makes it seemingly so much easier until women end up looking in their toilets, and the media refuses to tell those stories about what happens when they take these pills. And so often they are basically tortured and their children are killed, and they have to deal with that, and the media won't talk about it. So on that dour note, appropriately dour note, I would say I'll kick it open to the group. What can we expect sort of in the if we broaden the aperture a bit, what can we expect to change in American politics and culture with Roe now relegated to the ash heap of history?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think a few things. First off, on a purely political perspective, like I saw a number of people try and say, oh, this will be very bad for the Republicans at the polls. And I really don't think so. I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think first, I look at, comparatively, like what was like a galvanizing event in 2018 was the Kavanaugh confirmation, right? A lot of Republicans were radicalized by that and went to the polls. But I think part of what helped was not only did the Democrats like do something really appalling in the way they treated him, but we ultimately prevailed, right? Kavanaugh was ultimately confirmed. And there's something like galvanizing about, hey, we as a movement triumphed over adversity. There's no triumph for the Democrats here. They just took a massive L in terms of what they wanted. And as a political movement, I cannot think of a corresponding failure on the part of Republicans, even as ineffectual as they've been, that would be, as magnified as this, right? Like on a primary central issue, that you had this massive, enormous, not just a legislative loss, but a court loss. That means you basically lost, not in every state, obviously, but you lost the right to an abortion in half the country. which is, and I can imagine what I've seen is a lot of Democrats pointing out like, hey, didn't we elect you to stop this? Isn't that why we donate all our time and energy? Like, we wanted you to not let this happen, and you let it happen, and you're going to raise money based on it. So I think that it's very demoralizing for the left. And I think that that's ultimately in the short term going to mean that the Republicans actually have a tailwind as a result of this. And the second thing is, I think, Emily's right. Hookup culture is going to take a beating, not completely, but a lot of people, especially if they live in states where they're not guaranteed the right to an abortion, I think it's going to dramatically shift behavior towards a positive thing, which is people being more careful with their sexual behavior. And that's good. Hookup culture is no good. And I think that's a very positive thing. I worry a little bit that my fear, and it's purely like a pragmatic political one. I think Republicans in some states will go a little too hard and get caught up banning like the hardest of hard cases. And I really don't want a world where we're like forced to sit around in elections and debate rape and incest exceptions. I don't think that that's like the weakest ground Republicans have in this issue. And so I'm just like hoping, basically I'm like just hoping nothing crazy happens, right? And in the next like 6 months, and hoping that we like can consolidate our political victories here, and not like get caught up in like the worst possible, like the weakest possible ground in this debate. That's my hope.
So two lines of comments. I'll try to be quick in our limited remaining time in this segment. The first is Henry Olson of EPPC and Washington Post in his recent column. It was a good column, but one thing that I want to highlight from it, he was basically making a plea to his fellow pro-lifers to recall that if you take opinion polling seriously on this issue, which is a dubious proposition, but like let's concede the premise of opinion polling, pro-lifers are in the minority, at least as far as the first trimester of pregnancy is concerned. We're very much in the majority as far as everything after that. It's just a friendly reminder that for those of us who are avowedly pro-life and we believe that legal protection should begin at the moment of fertilization, that we need to be aware that we are in the minority, and we should take that mentality, I think, to the public square when we're trying to change hearts and minds. But the other point that I want to make, which is what Will alluded to here, which is kind of the possible effect of kind of the downplaying of hookup culture. This is the idea that, to Emily's point, it's true that politics can be downstream of culture, but culture can also be downstream of politics and the law. And that is exactly what Will's alluding to, is that in certain red states where abortion might be heavily restricted, people's actual culture and behavior might actually change. And on that note, one strand of argument that I've actually already picked up, and I'm going to continue to kind of make, and I've been making this argument for a few years now, is that this does not represent the end goal. I just want to be clear from a pro-life perspective. The Dobbs case is a remarkable achievement and it is a necessary precondition to the actual end goal, but it is not the end goal. The end goal, as conservatives, who are really pro-life, I think have understood for decades, has been an actually abortion-free America, abortion abolitionism. There are 14th Amendment equal protection clause arguments on these grounds. I'm actually working on an op-ed on this topic right now. So that is going to be the next legal constitutional pro-life fight, is constitutional personhood. Justice Kavanaugh and his Dobbs concurrence totally swats that down. It was gratuitous. It was virtue signaling. It was completely unnecessary, in my opinion. But that is the next mid to long-term goal in the legal constitutional realm.
So just a quick point on the political element of this. I think it's going to be staggering for large swaths of the American population to see what the progressive position has become from safe, legal, and rare to infanticide on demand. And that really is indisputable. Infanticide is where certainly a minority of a minority are, but they probably have the loudest voices on this issue from the left. And I think that is going to redound to the left's detriment substantially, to the extent they try to make this the national issue in the midterm elections and then beyond the midterm elections. Frankly, I think the pro-life forces and the pro-choice to pro-abortion spectrum fervor on either side will probably cancel each other out, I suspect, ultimately, although this is going to be a state-by-state issue. And thank God this is a state-by-state issue. It's worth underscoring the point again. In some ways, this decision was the easy decision because it just says, give it back to the states. And now the so-called messiness of federalism actually transpires. But this is exactly how these decisions ought to be hashed out. And it's one of the few times, yes, we've seen with this court, but in recent memory where the court has said, no, it's on you, your legislators and the people to render these decisions, not us. Thank God that that is the case. And the last thing I'll make, and maybe we can talk about it in the parting shots or not, is just it was very interesting to see in the majority opinions, there's a focus on the tens of millions, 60 plus million lives taken as in the post-Roe era. And then on the other hand, to look at the left lamenting the fact that women today are going to bear all these hardships as a consequence of this. But that contrast in who the focus ought to be and who the real victims are here, I think is very telling about how the right and how the left view the world. And there are probably many takeaways that we might have from it, but it's just something that immediately struck me, who the focus was on in terms of who the victims are and where sympathy ought to be focused here is something that is quite interesting in terms of the contrast between right and left on this issue and likely so many other related issues as well.
All right. Well, that's everybody's segments. Let's do final thoughts. I guess I'll start with Josh.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess the only thing that I want to underscore here, I guess two things. One is, as someone, I've been a card-carrying member of the Federal Society since my first year of law school. I do a lot of FedSoc campus talks, but I've had an at times uneasy relationship because I tend to criticize it, albeit from within the fold, but I've tended to be very critical. I think on this week of all weeks, it is very important to give the Federal Society immense credit for what they have done here. They have achieved in this week probably more than they have achieved in multiple terms combined, right? I mean, this has been by far the most consequential week in the history of the modern conservative legal project. And, we can discuss what comes next. I just kind of alluded to that with the Equal Protection Clause, constitutional personhood stuff, and my whole common good originalism project is not going to go anywhere. But seriously, hats off to the Federal Society and all of those who have been involved with judicial nominations and getting us to this point. I guess the final thing I'll just say here, and this is not exactly a novel point, but it's just worth emphasizing. History, and I don't want to, I'm starting to sound like preacher-like on my soapbox here. History will, I think, one day view Roe versus Wade right alongside Dred Scott, Plessy, Korematsu as some of just the most egregious Supreme Court decisions in the United States history. I think the moral revulsion and disgust that anyone who goes to law school today and reads the Dred Scott opinion from Chief Justice Roger Taney in 1857, I really do think that is the way that law students, a generation or two from now, perhaps it might take time, will one day view Roe versus Wade when they go ahead and read Harry Blackmun's handiwork in that case. But it just bears repeating that Harry Blackmun, as monstrous as the Roe versus Wade decision was, the justice who wrote it, even he conceded. He literally said forthrightly in Roe versus Wade, anyone can just look it up right now. He says that if the unborn person is a person under the understanding of the 14th Amendment, then his decision doesn't make any sense. And he actually, to his very mild credit, he had the humility to concede that his decision might be revisited one day based on the evolving state of embryology of science. So the same cannot be said, obviously, of the ACLU, of kind of third wave feminists in particular, who have just tried to kind of do the whole a clump of cells disinformation campaign. But, look, what an amazing result. The fight goes on for constitutional personhood, but this week is really just a joyous week. And, I think I speak for all of us when I say that I'm just so profoundly happy.
I want to just touch on that point about how history will view Roe, because I feel like this is an inflection point, and I think we're in this tug of war between humanism and transhumanism, or it's probably better put as anti-humanism. And I like to say, whenever I talk about this, I don't mean to sound like I just smoked a bowl and decided to chat about the metaverse, but I do mean that a lot of these very technologies that, if you're like me, you're not even 30 yet, seem like they've always been around. They are our norm. Roe was always our norm. A lot of this stuff happened really quickly with new technologies that developed in the 20th century, and they are pushing us away from how we are meant to live. They have improved life immeasurably. They have lifted an immeasurable amount of people out of poverty, but they have changed the way that we live in very unhealthy ways. And Roe was a part of that. It was a part of changing our norms and making it easier for us to try and transcend what it is to be a human, what it is to be a woman, to escape our bodies instead of embracing them and learning to love and live with the limitations that God made us with as human beings. And so I think of this in that very sort of broad sense of being one moment in the tug of war. And there's a lot pushing us in the other direction on things that are not just to do with abortion. I've seen some truly horrific rhetoric that's casual around things like IVF recently. And that may seem crazy, but I'm very convinced that a lot of this we have just sort of been snowballing, the snowball careening down the hill, or the boiling frog who suddenly realizing that the heat has been turned up way too high and we're burning. So I have both optimism and pessimism. Optimism in that I think there's a human spirit fighting back when we see the numbers of how many younger Americans are pro-life as opposed to the boomer generation or the Xer generation. I think you see the fight in that, and in the Matt Walsh, What is a Woman reception and pop cultural impact. That's just one example, but the way that the conversation has gone with Title IX, all of these things, I think you can see the fight left. We are created to survive, and I think that's playing out. But we're also doing a lot of things that numb us from the pain of existence. And so who knows where this will go.
So while I continue to hold that it's basically Justice Thomas is the only sure vote, Justice Alito is there most of the time, and then all bets are off on a whole slew of issues with the other judges. I think one of the reasons that we are all, to one extent or another, so profoundly happy about these decisions is the fact that it feels like justice was actually done for once in an era, in an age where every single institution has eviscerated itself and been weaponized against us. This is one bastion that in these not so limited circumstances actually held up in the face of literal death threats and mobs outside these individuals' houses. So for that, because I'm sure they will backstab us in a whole slew of cases going forward, at minimum today, we should be appreciative and thankful for what was done here. Now, on the more cynical side of things, one question that we still don't have an answer to is who leaked the Alito opinion, number one. And obviously Will has a theory on that, which he's laid out at great length. But what is Chief Justice Roberts planning to do to that leaker? How is he planning to publicize it? What report will be out there? This story should not be able to die. The media may well try to kill it ultimately, but it should not die. That's number one. And then number two, because there's this one institution that held in these circumstances, of course, it's under substantial threat. And I would argue, and I argued before, that the effort to go at Justice Thomas through Ginny Thomas is part of the assault on the Supreme Court, which is aimed at, of course, ultimately packing the court, delegitimizing the court, while all the rhetoric, as some of our listeners and viewers probably saw on that Tucker Carlson monologue last night, is all about how the court delegitimized itself. It was illegitimate. Well, no, actually, it's all of these forces that want to delegitimize the court and make it and render it illegitimate through packing and a whole slew of other schemes to take away its actual power because it didn't bend to the progressives' whims on these particular issues. And I go back to the fact that the Justice Department really remarkably and disastrously, in my view, putting out these statements about these decisions. Now, maybe you say that this is Merrick Garland's revenge, but the fact of the matter is, if the DOJ is coming out and taking that position, that in and of itself leads to a potential constitutional crisis. We saw the executive branch, the administrative state, weaponized against the actual executive under the last administration. Here you have the DOJ, essentially an edifice of the executive branch, a part of the executive branch, going after the Supreme Court here. And I think you're going to see a total onslaught against it because no institution can be freed of the progressive anti-religion. And that's my main takeaway here. But thank God for what this court has done during this term.
Yeah, I think, I guess my final thought is 10 years ago, I would have said I was completely pro-choice, and I'm still non-religious, and so I guess my position might be characterized as very modestly pro-choice in the sense that I probably think that first trimester abortions should be permitted. That said, like, it's so dramatically different than, my position has moved dramatically to the right in the past decade, and particularly in the last 5 years. Watching the left advocate for things like abortion at full term, that it's just clearly barbaric. And I think, we look at today, I think that's yet another reason that I don't think the left is going to get much out of this. I think they had gotten themselves into a position where they weren't advocating safe, legal, and rare anymore. They were advocating barbaric. And I think, the corollary is the problem with safe, legal, and rare is that it doesn't emphasize rare enough, right? We want it to be rare first and foremost. And after that, we'll talk about safe and legal, right? And that maybe that's the rights line or something similar to it, that this should not be common at all, that this should be extraordinarily rare. And it's just bad for broader society. And that said, and so today I was thrilled when Roe was overturned. I think it was terrible law, and I think it was allowing, barbaric abortion practices that we wouldn't see anywhere else in the world, really, except in a few countries. So I think that's a very positive thing, and just along with a very positive week in general, the court that we've all talked about, all these great Second Amendment cases. So, with that, I think on behalf of Josh, Emily, and Ben, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain. See you at the next NatCon Squad.